At home, just real quick, Adele, can you see my screen? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, thank you. All right, so this first document that I'm going to pull up describes a thesis statement, open versus closed, and the counter argument thesis statement. This came directly from the textbook, so it's nothing new, but I just want to give you it all in one area if you feel like you need to review before you're writing your thesis statements today. A closed thesis statement is essentially what we're working on right now. I'm teaching you guys to write with directions because you're writing short essays, and I don't want you to lose track of your train of thought when you're writing, especially in a time situation. My hope is for later in the school year that you do or are able to pull away from a closed thesis into a more open thesis that's still complex enough and has the QBQ so that you can still score high. But just keep in mind the closed thesis has the major points written in the thesis statement. And there's an example there. Notice that it talks about, it asserts the series constitutes a literary classic and specifies why. Okay, so that you guys know what the closed thesis statement is. Next is the reason why closed thesis statements are good. Again, if you're writing a short focused essay under time constraints, and that's exactly what we're doing in AP language when we take that test. All right, the open thesis statement is broad. It's generally meant for longer pieces when you're not going to have enough. If you put a direction in it, it would make it really clunky and long. And so we've got an example here, but I really want to talk about is the counter argument thesis statement, because that's the kind of thesis statement that you write for a question 3 essay, which is the argument essay, okay? Very similar to what you guys did last year. The counter argument is a variant of both open and closed thesis statements. It begins with a summary of the counter argument, usually qualified by although or despite. Sound familiar? And proceeds with the writer's opinion. The advantage is that it immediately addresses the counter argument, so you can right off the bat prove that you are not biased. And it makes your argument stronger and more reasonable. Okay, so it can also create a seamless transition for you to concede or refute later. And here we've got an example. Although Harry Potter series may have some literary merit, notice that's the subordinate clause here. Its popularity has less to do with storytelling than merchandising. So the argument is going to be the independent clause, okay? And the subordinate clause is your counter argument. So this particular thesis promises some discussion of literary merit and a critique of its storytelling, which is the concession and refutation again, but it ultimately is going to focus on the merchandising part. Okay, so keep in mind that when you're writing, the majority of the argument or the major argument, it's going to come from your independent clause. And this is a really important part considering that I'm asking you to write a counter-argument thesis for these types of essays. They can lead to modification and qualification. Now, qualification just means that you recognize there's not a clear-cut answer. That's why I asked you to qualify, okay? When someone qualifies, it means that they recognize in some respects that there are other opinions that could be correct. It's not a black and white answer. So that's very important that you recognize, and that's why we almost always qualify a question 3 essay. All right, now I'm going to take you to notes on the question 3 essay and a generator. Now, the question 3 essay thesis is almost exactly like the question 2 essay thesis, but the question 2 essay thesis, you could do that qualifying subordinate clause, whereas in a question 3 argument essay, I require that subordinate counter-argument clause. Okay, so if you guys look at this PowerPoint here, it's going to look really familiar. Does this look familiar to you guys? You must have a topic that's a noun. You must have a claim that's an action verb. You must have at least two directions that are adjective adverb or adjective noun. a universal idea, and that subordinate clause. So it's very familiar, right? Just like the one that we wrote a few weeks ago. You're still going to circle box squiggle check it, just to make sure you've got all your parts. Here is just some notes on that qualifying subordinate clause. They can start with any kind of subordinate conjunction that suits your purpose, although, unless, while, even though, etc. The point you argue will fall in the independent clause, which I just mentioned, and the point that presents the exception will fall into the subordinate clause. Again, that qualifier keeps you from making an extreme claim. One thing I would like you guys to make sure you avoid is don't use absolute words like all or none or always or never, because like I said, these argument situations that we're going to discuss, it's not all yes or all no. There's all kinds of shades of gray. So when you use a word like most as opposed to all, you keep your argument flexible, if that makes sense. I've got some example thesis statements here. I'll let you guys look at those once you get into your groups. This is the thesis generator. That makes it easy to write a question 3 thesis. So you receive the prompt, you mark it up, you figure out your opinion, then you'll find one positive thing to say or a negative in support of the argument. So, for example, this particular prompt was about required community service. So one good thing about required community service is that it's laudable. In general, community service is laudable. Both the giver and the receiver benefit. That's one good thing about required community service. All right. Now, to come up with your actual argument, you think of 2 or 3 contradictory things to say about your original statement. One being required community service isn't altruistic, thus it isn't morally uplifting to the provider. Another contradictory thing is that required community service will likely be less effective because that drafted volunteer would be poorly motivated. So those are 2 things that contradict my original statement. Does that make sense? So I'm building an argument just by finding positives and negatives. Now, here's my thesis statement. Although programs that encourage community service likely have laudable consequences for providers and receivers, my subordinate clause, talking about the good things about it, any program compelling service fails to morally uplift the provider while likely providing inefficient service to its intended beneficiary. So it's kind of that easy. You find one good thing to say and 2 or 3 bad, or one bad thing and 2 or 3 good, depending upon which side of the argument that you're making. All right. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to create breakout rooms. I'm going to stop recording.